Welcome into 5 Wide Fantasy. Today I've got 3 wide receivers you should not be drafting to your fantasy team. Definitely not one of my favorite videos to do, but I always got to find guys that I'm going to tell you to draft, and then we got to find guys that you should be avoiding. But I want to make this very clear because I think a lot of people get this confused. When you list a player as a do not draft guy or a player to avoid, it doesn't necessarily mean that in no scenario would I draft him. If I have 4 or 5 fantasy teams, I don't always like to have the same guys over and over and over again. I like to have diversity when it comes to different teams, giving me the best chance to win a championship or one or two of those leagues. But these are guys at their current ADP I definitely am not looking to draft. Now, there's of course a number that I would draft them at, and you guys will see it when our full screen player cards come up. You'll see my ranking on these guys, and that is where I'd be willing to draft them and think you can get good value on them. But if you guys do enjoy the video today, be sure to drop a like, subscribe to the channel as well, help us get to 30,000 subscribers here on YouTube. We're also very close to training camp opening this week. The Jets are on Hard Knocks. Doesn't seem like they're too happy about that. So very excited for the season to get going and having tons of news, info to get to you guys. So be sure to follow us here. We'll have stuff posted on the shorts. We have the 5 Wide TikTok, which we posting lots of updates there throughout the preseason and throughout training camp. But let's get into our first player. All these guys going in, I believe, the 5th round or earlier. I think with the last guy, he's going in the 5th round. But let's start with one going fairly early, and that is Deebo Samuel of the San Francisco 49ers. He's currently going as the wide receiver 16 at the end of the 3rd round. He was the wide receiver 37 in 2022, okay? This isn't just because of his performance. It also had to do with injuries, but even when you take injuries into account here, he was the wide receiver 25 in fantasy points per game. He was going even earlier than this wide receiver 16 ADP from last season. Deebo, there's a massive issue here, and I really don't understand why people are wanting to take him at this value and at this ADP. He was the wide receiver 41 in fantasy points per game, not just wide receiver 41 overall, in fantasy points per game once Christian McCaffrey arrived in week 7. He averaged 6.9 fantasy points per game. He only averaged 6.1 targets, 4.1 receptions, and 41 yards a game. And he scored, I think, 1 rushing touchdown during that span. So it was not a good season for you as a Deebo Samuel owner, especially after Christian McCaffrey arrived. And there's a few things here that give me a major concern when it comes to drafting a guy this early. His ADOT was just over 4 yards, which was the 3rd lowest amongst, I think, 90 qualified wide receivers, which are guys that had 15 plus targets. So we know his ADOT is low. That's always been his MO, even in his most successful seasons in fantasy. But as well, during that span of those weeks 7 to 18, he was the wide receiver 58 in yards per route run. Of the big 4 in this offense between him, McCaffrey, Ayuk, and Kittle. He was last between those 4 guys. Like, this was not a good finish to the season for him. Even when he was on the field, yards per route run, take into account how many routes you're running. So again, this isn't a number that takes into account the time he missed. Time he missed is no excuse for this performance, and why I think he is going to be a player that is a major bust for you this season. I'm definitely wanting to avoid him. We have a player with far too low of volume, and his ADOT, like we talked about, isn't very high. Like, there are players that can get away with low receiving totals and low reception volume, but they can hit big explosive plays. Like Mike Williams was that type of guy in fantasy before the arrival of Joe Lombardi. He could hit on some big plays and return you value. Now, he is going as a top 16 wide receiver. A.J. Brown hits explosive plays. He's elite after the catch. There's no doubt about that. He was the 6th best wide receiver in yards after the catch during that span, that week 7 to 18 that we'll just continue to harp on here because, again, that's when McCaffrey's on the field. But despite being so good after the catch, it still resulted in a fantasy finish, like I mentioned, as the wide receiver 41. Like, the numbers just are not good enough. He's being drafted as if CMC isn't there. Because if you look at those weeks 1 to 6 before McCaffrey arrived, he was 14th in yards, 12th in receptions, and 13th in targets. So that puts him in, that tier of like a wide receiver 16, as long as he can find the end zone a little bit. McCaffrey's running those similar routes to him as that guy in those short areas of the field, like we talked about with that low ADOT, and he's also taking away the rushing volume. Like, you look at weeks 1 to 6, Deebo had 23 rushing attempts for 136 yards and a touchdown. And then you look at weeks 7 to 18, he only had 14 rushing attempts for only 71 yards and a touchdown. So we're losing receiving volume. We're dropping rushing volume nearly by half, and the way that he is used in this offense just isn't beneficial enough from a fantasy perspective to be able to return a guy being drafted in the 3rd round. If I'm looking at a receiver in this span, I need to realistically be able to say, hey, this guy could finish in the top 5 and tell you exactly why. I cannot show you or put together any type of puzzle here that tells me here's how Deebo Samuel finishes a top 5 wide receiver. Because if you're drafting him this early, he needs to at least be able to realistically do that. So I'm definitely avoiding Deebo at his current ADP. Next up here, and a guy, I think much like a couple of players we talked about in my must draft wide receivers video, like Chris Godwin and Courtland Sutton, you probably aren't going to like hearing this, but I think you should probably hear me out when it comes to why I'm not drafting T. Higgins right now at his current ADP as the wide receiver 13 going in the middle of the 3rd round. He was wide receiver 17 in 2022. Okay, this has nothing to do with his talent or his ability. I just think the ceiling isn't there. It's much like Deebo Samuel, where I cannot conjure up a way that this guy could finish top 5 at the position. And I'm taking him as a wide receiver, the wide receiver 13, almost as a wide receiver 1 on the season. Depending on some of your leagues, he's going to go inside the top 12 at this ADP, as I mentioned, as wide receiver 13. We saw him for 5 weeks without Jamar Chase, okay? We got to see that opportunity, that thing you dream of when you draft T. Higgins. You're like, well, this guy can be great as it is, and then if Jamar Chase goes down, he can absolutely crush it for me and be one of the best receivers in fantasy football. Well, he wasn't. He just was not. 5 weeks that he wasn't available, he was the wide receiver 11 in fantasy points per game. So he had a good span without Jamar Chase, but not something that's far surpassing what his current ADP is, and this is a dream scenario of Jamar Chase not being available. There isn't one thing, much like some guys will talk about here, where you hang your hat on. It's he scores a lot of touchdowns. He has a crazy receiving volume. He hits some big explosive plays. He does none of those things. Okay, last season he was 27th in targets, 25th in receptions, 19th in yards. Okay, yes, he missed some time. He was banged up. He probably potentially, you didn't make you probably might have lost a playoff matchup if you had him, because there was the one game late in the season where they played him, or they started him and dressed him, but played him pretty much, I think, like a few snaps early in the game, and he just wasn't healthy enough to go. So yes, these numbers could improve if he played a little bit more last season. But even when you look at other numbers here, he was 30th in yards per reception. Those aren't explosive plays. 50th in ADOT. He's not being looked at deep downfield. 42nd in target rate. The target share isn't there. Jamar Chase has like a near 30% target share. He's not going to be taking that away from him. And then we have 47th in end zone targets. Jamar Chase dominated this category in end zone targets on the season despite missing time. T. Higgins does not have any of these roles that are important when it comes to fantasy points. T. Higgins is incredibly valuable to this Bengals team and this Bengals offense and the Bengals success. But when it comes to your fantasy team and your fantasy team success, he just isn't there. And to me, this isn't about the player. This is about looking at guys that are available around that ADP. So let's take a few guys, for example, here. I got 3 guys that I want to point to. Devontae Smith is the first one. He was top 5 in targets, receptions, and yards in the last 5 weeks of the season. He was better than A.J. Brown. Like, this is a guy that could have ridiculously good volume and see it continue. And this Eagles offense, or this Eagles team, if they weren't in so many winning game scripts last season, they would have thrown the ball a hell of a lot more too. So there's a guy that I'm way more excited about. Chris Olave. He gets a QB upgrade after posting a 27% target share and having the 4th most deep targets in the league. Give me Chris Olave instead of T. Higgins every single time. And the last guy, Amari Cooper, that I find a lot of people aren't really in on this season and are opposed to me as a top 12 guy. He's a top 12 guy for me. And it's because he has a quarterback who obviously struggled last season, but has already posted a season where he led the NFL in passing yards. And Amari Cooper already displayed his ability to demand target volume for the Browns offense. I think the Browns take a step forward, and I'm much higher on Amari Cooper than I am T. Higgins. The ceiling isn't there. We saw him in that best possible scenario last season, and he still wasn't able to far exceed his current ADP. Jamar Chase is back. Jamar Chase might be the number 1 wide receiver in fantasy football this season. I'm not taking T. Higgins to be a top 12 wide receiver as well. I just don't see it. I'd rather look at other options like we talked about earlier. My last guy going in the middle of the 5th round, it is DJ Moore. He's currently the wide receiver 22 going in the 504. That's another player that I'll kind of be looking at my screen here, so I make sure I get you guys all this information correctly. He was the wide receiver 22 in 2022, so he finished last year at the same as what his current ADP is, but he was the wide receiver 34 in fantasy points per game. He was able to play and be healthy for the entirety of the season. And my concern here is moving to this Bears offense, the rushing volume. So I dug into the numbers a little bit. The Bears obviously ran the ball at a 56% rate last season. Do I expect them to run the ball that high of a rate, which was one of the highest in football the last 10 years? No, but I still expect them to run the ball at a higher than 50% rate, because when you take into account the fact They ran the ball 56% rate and then got the first overall pick. Like, those aren't game scripts to run the football. But typically when you're losing, I think this team will be a little bit better. Not great, but a little bit better. But even then, I do expect them to throw the ball a little bit more in another building year here for Justin Fields, and then getting a better wide receiver for him in DJ Moore. But I looked at the teams in the NFL in the last 5 seasons that ran the ball at a 50% plus rate, which I still think the Bears will do. There were 10 teams here and a number, obviously, of wide receivers. Only 2 players were able to beat DJ Moore's current ADP. Those 2 guys, A.J. Brown and Tyler Lockett, they both recorded double-digit touchdown seasons in that year. Tyler Lockett had 10 touchdowns. I think he only had like 70-some, like 74 targets maybe, and he finished as, I think, the wide receiver 15, I believe. The touchdowns were the big thing there, hitting some explosive plays. But with these 2 guys, well, of course, with A.J. Brown, his target volume was great, but he also scored 11 touchdowns. With these 2 guys, though, and it's something to keep in mind, these were winning teams. The Titans finished 11-5 in A.J. Brown's 2020 season when he posted when this offense was running the ball more than 50% of plays. And then for Tyler Lockett, it was 2018, and the Seahawks finished the year 10-6. So these are guys that they saved their fantasy finish and managed to beat this ADP that we have for DJ Moore because they scored a bunch of touchdowns. Do I think the Bears are going to be a 10-6, 11-5 team? Absolutely not. Are they going to be better than the number 1 overall pick, worst record in the NFL that they had last season? Yes, I think they'll be a few wins better. I think they'll probably be in like that 5-6 range. I should have looked to see what their win total is at DraftKings, but I didn't get the chance to look at that. I should have done that. But regardless, the other thing that worries me here is that neither one of these guys, neither of A.J. Brown or Tyler Lockett, played with a quarterback that's as mobile as Justin Fields. Like, yes, Ryan Tannehill can score a couple rushing touchdowns. Russell Wilson was capable of doing that in 2018, but none of them were as mobile as Justin Fields or as big of a threat on the ground as Justin Fields. Fields was 2nd in red zone rushing attempts last season, and he had 5 inside the 5 touchdowns, which was also 2nd at the position. So that is where, we need the touchdowns for DJ Moore to perform and return this finish, and then we have a QB who's more than capable of stealing those from him, and there's going to be really, really important because Moore, he set a career high last year with 7 touchdowns on the season, scored a bunch of them at the tail end of the year, but he was known for his previous, 4 years in the league that he could not score touchdowns. He never posted more than 4 in those 4 seasons prior. So that's been a problem up until last year. Now he changes teams. Can he maintain that finish in terms of touchdown output? I'm not so sure. And as well, he's likely to post the lowest target total since his rookie season. A.J. Brown, like I mentioned, was one of those guys that could finished inside of a DJ Moore's current ADP. He had 106 targets, which would be lower than what DJ Moore's posted in his last 4 seasons. And he had a 26% target share, which was 9th in the NFL. So I expect DJ Moore to take a big target share of this Bears offense, but that doesn't necessarily mean this is a guy that can post 120 targets. He's going to need to, do roughly that and find the end zone a bunch to return on this ADP. And there's way too much here that just points me in the wrong direction. DJ Moore, much like T. Higgins, very valuable piece of this offense, a much needed addition to improve this team overall. But does that mean you need to draft him in fantasy? I don't really think so. I'm definitely worried about taking him. Of course, there's a number I would take him at, but it's definitely more in the wide receiver 3 range than in this wide receiver 2 range that he's currently at. All right, those are my do not draft wide receivers for the 2023 fantasy season. If you guys enjoyed the video, be sure to let me know. Drop a like, subscribe to the channel. We'd really, really appreciate it. And if you have any questions or comments for me, drop those down below. Happy to answer them with a reply, but more importantly, would love to answer them in a video as well. We want to do that more and more on the show, interacting with you guys. Really appreciate everybody for watching, and we will see you on the next one.